Hello everyone, in this episode I'm going to talk about how you can integrate JSON Web Tokens authentication in Blazor WebAssembly application. Before we get started, let's thank Hamza who posted this comment. This video series is open for suggestions until .NET 6 comes out, where Blazor team has added more features. When it comes out, then I'll start making videos about the features that they have added in .NET 6. Let's try to understand the problem statement. Let's understand why do we need to use JSON Web Tokens in our application. So for this demo, I'm going to be using Blazor application, of course, and then we have ASP.NET Core as backend and SQLite as our database, but you can use any database that you like. So to authenticate the user, you use their username and password and send that request to API. API checks username and password in the database, authenticates the user, and sends the user back to the client if the username and password exist in the system. Now, once the user is in the system, you need to authorize the API request too. You can't just keep your API request. You can't keep your API open for public, right? You need to authorize your request. To do that, you can't pass username and password again and again. You can't authenticate user for every data request. That makes the system slower. Also, you could have authentication server different than the transaction servers for your application. So that could get a little tricky. Also, it's not safe to pass username and password again and again to authorize the request. And that's why you should use JSON Web Tokens. So whenever you send username and password for the first time, when you're authenticating the user, the server will use a secret key to generate a JSON Web Token. And that JSON Web Token will be sent back to the client. Now you also authenticate the user. You just not generate the JSON Web Token. You first authenticate the user. If user exists in the database, then you generate the JSON Web Token. You send that JSON Web Token back to the client. Now it's client's responsibility to store that JSON Web Token. Once client has the JSON Web Token, then it can send that token to authorize the request. Now, this JSON Web Token is generated using a secret key, which only server knows. That's why server can validate that JSON Web Token. And once the JSON Web Token is validated, then the server sends the response back. If someone changes that JSON Web Token, then server knows that JSON Web Token is not generated at the server, and it tells the client that this is not the correct JSON Web Token. So that's why you should use JSON Web Tokens. How does it look like? JSON Web Tokens are divided into three parts. You can see this text. It is divided by three text. One part is here, then there is a period, then the second text is here, there is a period, and then there's the last text. These three parts are, the first part is header, where you're telling what algorithm you're using and what's the type of the token. And the second part is the payload, where you store the claims when the token was issued. And the last part is the signature, wherever you are encoding your header with base64 encoder and your payload too. And then you'll use your key, which is 256-bit longer. That means 32 bytes. That means your key should be longer than 32 characters. And once you put that there, then you can verify your signature. That means that the signature which is generated here matches the key which is used for generating the token. Now, for this demo, we'll have to follow 5 steps. First, we authenticate the user. We check the username and password, make sure that the user exists in the system. Then we generate the token on the server side, and then we store the token on the client side. Then we use the token to tell the client to stay logged in. That's the only way for our Blazor application to tell the client that the user is logged in, keep the user logged in. The fourth step is to use the token to make the request to your server. Authorize the API. You don't want to keep your API public. You want to authorize your request, and you'll use that JSON Web Token for that. And finally, we'll log out, where we delete the JSON Web Token from the client and will tell client to refresh itself so that it can kick out the user. We are going to use BlazingChat application that we have been working for this series. I have already covered the part where you can authenticate using cookie authentication. I've added the link of that video in the video description, but we'll use the same application to integrate JSON Web Tokens in our application. So let's get started. Like I mentioned in the previous section, we'll be using BlazingChat application. And in this application, I've already added cookie authentication, and I've covered that in custom authentication state provider episode. I have added the link of that episode in the video description if you're curious. So if I enter John Smith's email address and password and then click on login, then application generates a cookie, and we use that cookie to determine if the user is authenticated or not. If I navigate to different pages, then application stays logged in, the user stays logged in. Even if I refresh the page, then also user stays logged in. The application uses this cookie to determine if the user is authenticated or not. And if I click on logout, then that cookie gets deleted and then I get pushed to the login page. If I try to navigate to the profile page, then I get kicked out because there is no cookie. I'm not authenticated to view the profile page. But instead of using cookies, we're going to use JSON Web Tokens to determine if the user is authenticated or not. And we'll store that in the local storage here. We'll store that as key value pair, and we'll use that token to determine if the user is authenticated or not. Now let's go ahead and make some changes in our application, make some changes in our code to generate the JSON token first, JSON Web Token first, and then we'll use that token to determine if the user is authenticated or not, and we'll use that token to make authorized requests to the data which is coming from the server. So the first thing that you need to do is open your server project and go to your app settings.json, and here I'm going to add a key that I'm going to use for generating the token. So I'm going to use some snippets here to add the key. The key should be secret key. You're not supposed to share this key with anyone. And it has to be more than 32 characters. It has to be longer than 32 bytes. It has to be equal to 32 bytes or longer than that. And we'll use this key to generate JSON Web Token. I'm going to generate this token in my controller, in my user's controller, wherever I'm validating if the user is in the system or not. So first I'm going to generate the token. For that, I'm going to use another snippet, which is going to generate the JSON Web Token. And here, this function takes a user parameter. So once we figure out if the user exists in the system or not, I'm going to pass that user to this method, which will use the key that we just added. So we added this key, which is secret, and I'm going to use that key to generate the JSON Web Token later on here. So we're going to need the key for, we're going to get the bytes of that string too, and that's what we're going to pass in the token. So I'm using encoding ASCII get bytes and passing that string there. We're also creating claims. We are creating that user's email address, and we're using that user's user ID as name identifier. So we're creating two claims, and we're passing those two claims in claims identity, which eventually we are passing to this token descriptor. So this token descriptor comes from this namespace. So make sure that you're adding this namespace in your user controller, otherwise you'll get errors. So we're using this security token descriptor where we are passing the claims identity that we just created. We're also telling the token descriptor to expire this token in next 7 days. We're also passing the key, which is the bytes that we just got. And then we're also telling in token descriptor which algorithm we should use in order to generate the token. And we'll pass this token descriptor to JWT security token handler, and we'll call this create token method in which we are passing this token descriptor. It will give you a token which will pass again to the token handler to write the token, which will return a string, and that's what we're going to save in our browser. So this is how you generate the token. Let's go ahead and create a web API, which is going to help us authenticate the request. So this needs to get generated after we authenticate the user, right? So I'm going to add a web API, which is going to be authenticate JWT user control. So this is going to be a web API that we are going to call from the client, which takes authentication request as parameter and authentication response as the return. So if I go to its definition, it is pretty simple. It has email address and password in the request, and in the response, there's only one thing, which is the string token. It's a string value, and it's the token which gets generated after the user is authenticated. So first we encrypt the password because the passwords are encrypted in the database, and then we pass that email address and encrypted password using entity framework core. Will check if the user is there in the database or not. If the user is there, then I'm generating the token. I'm passing that user in this method that we just added, and it will generate the token for this user. So the user that we're going to find in the system. And then finally, I'm assigning that token to the response, and then that response will be sent back to the client. Now let's go ahead and make this web API request. For that, I'm going to go to my client project. I'm going to open my client project here, and then go to my view models because that's where I write most of my code. Here I have this method authenticate JWT, and this is what we're going to call from our Razor component. And we're going to add authenticate JWT snippet here. And this method has to be async, so I'm going to add async here. Here we are just creating the request. We are creating authentication request where we are passing email address and the password, which are mapped to our login UI. We're getting the email address and password from the text boxes. And then we're passing that authentication request to our authenticate JWT web API that we just added, this post request. And we're making a HTTP client post as JSON request, and we're passing that here. And we'll get HTTP message response, which will have authentication response, and that's what we're returning back to the UI. So let's go ahead and make this, call this authenticate JWT from the login page. For that, I'm gonna open my login page here, and then towards the end, I'm gonna add a method which is going to be authenticate JWT, and this method will make that call. We have injected this login view model in the UI, so I'm gonna call this method that I just added, this authenticate JWT method that I just added. I'm calling that method, and I'm getting the authentication response back. If the user is valid user, if user is authenticated, then the server will generate the token, which we will store in our browser using local storage service. This local storage service is actually from a package. If I open my project file here, so I'm using Chris Saint's Blazor local storage package to store JSON web token in my browser. You can also use that. Chris is awesome. Go ahead and use his packages. And then finally, I am navigating to the profile page, making sure that I'm reloading the the browser, but we don't need to do that right now. I'm just going to comment this piece of code. And if you don't find the user in the system, then I'm going to use another package made by Chris Sainty, which is toast service, to show error that the user is not valid. Let's go ahead and map this method to the button click. So whenever we click on this login button, I would like to call that method and generate the JSON Web Token. Let's go ahead and see if it is going to generate JSON Web Token in local storage or not. I just refreshed my application to get the latest bits, and I'm going to click on login, and it should generate that JSON Web Token. So if I click on login, then it generates that JSON Web Token, it authenticates the user, and it generates the JSON Web Token. I'm going to copy this. Let's copy this whole thing. I hope I can copy it. Okay. And then I'm going to go to JWT IO. And here I'm going to paste my JSON Web Token, remove the double quotes. And here you can see that it's using this algorithm HS256. The type of the token is JSON Web Token. Email address of the user is johnsmith@gmail.com. And the name identifier is the user ID. John Smith's user ID is 10. This is the time where before this is the token shouldn't be used before this time. You can see the time when I hover over it. And the expiry is June 28, 2021, which is 7 days from here. And issue date is June 21st, 2021. So you can see that the payload has all the information when it was issued, when it's going to get expired, and when it shouldn't be used before. And the last part is the encoded part of the header, where you can pass the secret key and validate your JSON Web Token. So currently you can see that it's saying invalid signature, but you can pass your key here. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to my app settings and copy my key here and put it here. Then you can see that the signature says it's valid now after receiving the key. If you tamper with the token, then it's going to say that it's invalid. And this is how the server tells you that the token is invalid and we are not supposed to send the response back to the user because the token has been tampered. So this is how you can generate the token and store it in the browser. In the next section, I'm going to use this token to stay logged in our Blazor WebAssembly application using custom authentication state provider. So in the previous section, we learned how we can authenticate the user and then generate a JSON Web Token and store that JSON Web Token in the local storage in our browser. Now we are going to use this JSON Web Token to keep the user logged into the system. So if I go back to my slides here, you can see that we completed this step. We authenticated the user, we generated the token, and we stored that token on the browser. Now we are going to use this token to stay logged into the system. To do that, I'm going to first create an API which is going to give me the user by JSON Web Token. So I'm going to pass this JSON Web Token to that API, and that API will give me the user. Then I can use that API in my state provider, which will give the current user whenever I make call to that API. So let's go ahead and add that API. For that, I'm going to go to my server project and open my controllers. And in users controller here, I'm going to add a method which is going to help me get the user by JSON Web Token. So I'm going to add a snippet here, which is going to be get user by JSON Web Token. And this method, like I said, it's a post method. It takes JSON Web Token and it uses the secret key. So we added a secret key. If I go to my app settings here again, we added this JSON settings secret key, and we use that to generate the token. Now we are going to use the same key to validate the token. So I'm going to get that key from configurations and then pass that to get byte array. This will return byte array. And then I'm going to use token validation parameter so that I could pass these parameters to token validator. The most important thing here is the issuer signing key, where we are passing the key, the byte array that we are getting from the key. So we're going to pass that into our token validation parameters too. You can check out these other configuration too. You can Google about them. The answers are pretty simple. And then we are going to use token handler to validate the token. We're using JWT security token handler to validate the token, where we're passing the JWT token, which will be sent from the client. This is the token we'll receive from the client. And we are passing token validation parameters, which has the key. So it's going to check this token with the key that we are passing as parameter, and it's going to validate and give us the claims principal if the token is valid. It also gives us security token, which is an out parameter, and we are converting that security token into JSON web token. So if this JSON security token is not null and the algorithm that we're using is the same as we used for generating the token, then we can get the user's names identifier. So when we generated the token, if I scroll up here, when we generated the token, we added user's user ID as claims identity, which was claims name identifier. And I'm using the same names identifier to get the user ID. And then I'm going to pass that user ID to my entity framework core to get the user. And that's what I'm returning back in this web API. And we can use this web API to make sure that the JSON web token that we have passed is valid or not. Now we'll have to make call to this web API every time we refresh our application or every time we need to check the state of the user. And that's something that we do from custom authentication state provider. So if I go to my client project here, it has this custom authentication state provider, which inherits from authentication state provider. This is a client project again. And this is, if I'm inheriting authentication state provider, I'll have to override this get authentication state async, which is actually going to give us the state of the user. Currently, it's giving state of the user based on this web API call, which is get current user. And this checks by cookie authentication. So if I go back to my user controller and scroll up, then I have this get current user, and it checks the authentication by cookie. So if the user is authenticated, then it's going to return the user. But in our case, we are going to get the user by JSON web token. So instead of calling that web API, I'm going to have to call this get user by JWT web API. But we are also passing JSON web token. So I'm going to add a method here, which is going to get the user by JSON web token. So I'm going to add a method, which is going to be get user by JWT async. This method gets the token from local storage. It's going to get this JWT token. And if the token is null, then it's going to return null. That means the user is not authenticated. But if it's not null, then it's going to go ahead and create that request. It's going to create that post request. If I go back, you can see that it's a post request. And I'm calling that get user by JWT. And in content, I'm passing JWT that I'm getting from my local storage. This is that JWT I'm passing as content. Then I'm making the HTTP request, I'm passing request message here, I'm getting the response, and then I'm reading the response as user. If I find the user, then I'm passing that user, telling my application that user is authenticated. Otherwise, I'm passing null. That means user is not authenticated. Now this method I want to call here whenever I get authentication state async. So I'm going to comment this and I'm going to say we would like to call get user by JWT async instead of calling this old method, which will give me the user by JSON web token. Now I'm going to go to my login page, and in the last section, we removed a line. We commented a line, which was this navigation manager navigate to profile true. So I want my application to navigate to profile true and force reload. If I navigate, this is a force reload. That means it will refresh the application and it will get the JSON web token, which is stored in the local storage. It will first call this method. It will first call this get authentication state async method, and it's going to get the user by JSON web token, which we are getting from the local storage. And then it's going to pass that JSON web token and get the user eventually. So let's go ahead and run this and see if our user stays logged in after we click on this button. So I'm going to delete the token which was generated before and refresh my page here so that I could get the latest bits. And now I'm going to click on this login, which is going to authenticate the user. It's going to generate JSON web token. It's going to refresh my application after authentication so that it could pass that JSON web token to a web API, which is going to get us the user, which will tell my application that the user is authenticated. So I'm going to click on this, and then it's going to generate JSON web token. It's going to refresh our application. It's going to keep that JSON web token in local storage, and you can see that I am logged in into the system. Now, if I refresh my application, it's going to use this JSON web token to keep my user logged in into the system. You can see that it's still logged in into the system. So this is how you can use JSON web token to validate the user and get the user, keep that state of the user, keep the user logged in. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how we can use the token, how we can use this token. Let's make this bigger. How we can use this token to authorize the API request in the API request that we are making to get the data from the server. In the previous section, we learned how we can authenticate the user, generate the token, store that token on the browser in the local storage, and then use that token to keep the user logged in. So if I click on this login button, then it's going to generate the token and it's going to keep the user logged in even after refreshing the page. But the whole reason why we generated the token so that we could authorize our web API requests. But if I go to my controllers and if I open my contacts controller, you can see that I'm not really authorizing any web API request. So I'm gonna uncomment this and then go back to my application. Let's refresh our application to make sure that we have the latest bits. And then I'm going to go to console here and then click on contacts. Then you can see that it throws error saying that the request that you're making, you're not authorized. You're getting this 401 error. That means once you put authorized tag, you need to send a token to validate this request. And we are not sending that. But before you send this, before you uncomment the authorized tag and send token, you need to add that support in your startup.cs. So if I go to my startup.cs here and look at the authentication support that I've added, so here I'm using cookie authentication, and we're not using cookie authentication anymore. We are using JSON web token authentication. So instead of this, I'm going to add support for checking JSON web token authentication. So I'm going to add authentication support here, which is going to have the default scheme as JSON Web Token bearer default authentication scheme, and same for default challenge scheme too. And instead of adding cookie, I'm gonna add JWT bearer, which will have some options in which we are passing this token validator parameter. So this is important, where we are passing the key. So just like we validated the user by the key when we were getting the user by JWT, it's going to do the same thing, but it's going to do it internally by using that authorized tag. And so I'm going to pass this key, get the bytes, and then JSON Web Token authorization will take care of the rest. Make sure that you have these two lines added, app.authentication and authorization added. And also, in order to use this JWT bearer, you're going to need a package that you need to add. So if I open my server project, you can see that package here. You can see this authentication JWT bearer package that I've added. You can add the latest package. It should work just fine. Now that this package is added, we are going to need to pass token from our client. And we are making a lot of web API requests. I don't want to add the token for each and every request. I don't want to go to each and every method and add that token. I want to have a message handler on the client side, which is going to add token to all the requests which are going through that handler. I have already done that. I've added a class here, which is a handler, which is custom authorization handler, which is inheriting from delegating handler. And here we have to override its send async method so that we can change the request which is getting sent. So you can check it's sending the request and receiving the response. So every handler, every HTTP client which is using this handler, whenever we make the request, it's going to change its header wherever we're adding the JSON Web Token. So I'm injecting local storage here and using that local storage to get the JSON Web Token, which is stored in our application. This is that JSON Web Token. And I'm going to get that and pass as a bearer. I'm going to pass that custom authentication handler. I'm going to pass that. And I'm calling base method to make the request, and it's going to return the response back. And now that we have this handler, we can add this handler to our services. I can go to my program.cs, and here I have already added custom authorization handler as a transient service. And once I add this, then I can add this handler to my named HTTP clients. So if I go to my contacts page, let's go to our contacts page here. If I go to my contacts page, here I'm injecting contacts view model, and that is actually coming from add HTTP clients method that I'm calling when I am calling the main method on program.cs on WebAssembly side. So whenever I add these HTTP clients, I'm adding the profile view model client, contacts view model client, and settings view model client, which is actually this contacts view model. So whenever I'm adding my HTTP clients, which is named HTTP client, I can add that custom authorization handler as a message handler to this name HTTP client. So whenever this HTTP client makes a request, it's going to add that JSON Web Token to authorize the request for the server. So I'm going to add a message handler here of type custom authorization handler. Now, once I do this, then every request my contacts view model is going to make, which is going to be from my Razor component, it's going to send that JSON Web Token, and my server will recognize that JSON Web Token because that's the token which was generated from the server using the key, and it should be able to make this request. So I'm going to go back to my contacts page here again. I'm running .NET Watch, so every time I make the file changes, the application gets recompiled. I'm gonna refresh my page. Now this time we'll have the JSON web token. So if I refresh the page, it's going to use that JSON web token, make the request, get the data, and show that data on the page. So this is how you can send your JSON web tokens. You don't have to add that JSON web token for each and every request. But you have to do that for your named HTTP client. Let's go ahead and try and do that for the profile view model and settings view model. So I'm going to copy this line and add that line here. And same I'm going to do for my settings view model too. And then we can go to our controllers. I'm going to go to my profile controller, uncomment this uncomment this authorized tag, go to settings controller, uncomment this authorized tag. Now, every request that we're making, every web API request that we're making, we are sending JSON web token with it. Server is authorizing that request and then sending the data back. So I'm going to refresh my application here. If I go to profile page, I can see the data. If I go to contacts page, I can see the data. If I go to settings page, I see the data. Now on the logout button, we would like to delete this JSON web token and refresh our application so that it stays logged out. For that, I'm gonna close all these tabs first and then go to my client and open my shared folder. And here we were making a web API to log out the user, but we're not gonna do that. Instead of that, we are going to actually delete, remove JSON web token, JWT token from the browser, and then I'm going to the landing page on the login page and I'm refreshing the browser so that the user stays logged out. Now I'm gonna refresh my application and it's going to stay logged in because we still have the JSON web token. But once I click on this log out, then it's going to delete that token. Now we don't have the token. Now if I try to go to the profile page, it's going to kick me out saying that, hey, you don't have token, you can't get in. But if I click on this login button, it's going to authenticate, generate the token, use that token to keep the user logged in. It's going to send that token to authorize all the web API requests that I'm making. And once I click on this logout button, it's going to delete that token and keep user logged out of the system. So that was the fifth step. So if I go to my my steps here, we used the token. We used the token to authorize the API request, and then we logged out of the system and we deleted the token. That's how you use JSON web tokens. If you have any questions, you can ask those questions in the comment section below, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. The code for this demo is on GitHub. You can find the link in the video description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.